Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another night of Apologia. If this is your first time here, I'm going to give you the quick lay of the land, let you know how the evening is going to go, how you can text in questions for the Q&A at the end of the night, and then we'll welcome Dr. Meyer out, and we'll get the show on the road. So first and foremost, we'll spend about an hour just in conversation, just to kind of fly over lay of the land. Then we'll take a 15-minute intermission. You get some water, use the restroom. Of course, you can do that at any point. Just do your best to slip out quietly. And while we're thinking about it, if you have your phone, slip those into silent, double check for us. That really helps the presenters. Appreciate it. Feel free to be on your phone, however, to text in questions. We'll pop that number up here. It'll be behind me on the screens. And to do us a favor in processing those, don't wait till the intermission to send us your questions. Send them to us as you have them so we have the chance to compile them all together and get them to Pastor Alec and Dr. Meyer in advance for the Q&A time at the end. So we'll spend about an hour together, take a 15-minute break. We'll be back at the end of that break to spend about 45 minutes or so with the Q&A time. The bathrooms are wildly inconveniently located on totally separate corners. So the women's restroom is on that side of the lobby. The men's restroom is on that side of the lobby. Also, if you happen to drop something or you were here a month ago at our last Apologia and you lost something, our lost and found is on that side along with the water fountain. Okay, so beyond that, there are a couple tables. If you didn't have the chance to encounter them as you came in or you just got here and came right to your seat, the Discovery Institute has a table of which Dr. Meyer is associated with, have some of his books there, and along with Family Policy Institute of Washington, who has been here consistently with us. They're an organization that helps keep track of legislation happening in Washington state, specifically pertinent to faith and family and those kinds of things. So I encourage you to stop and check that out as well. Now, as much as I so enjoy all the speakers we have and how eminently qualified they are, it makes my job very difficult because their bio is quite detailed. So if you are unfamiliar with Dr. Meyer, let me give you a brief introduction before we welcome him out. He holds a PhD in philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge. He's a former geophysicist and university professor. He is currently the director for the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. He's a national speaker and an accomplished author with works in scientific journals and editorials. He's not unfamiliar with the New York Times bestsellers list, and his most recent book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, came out last year. I believe we have that at the table this evening. So without further ado, would you please help me welcome Dr. Stephen Meyer.
Well, it's great to see everybody here tonight. Welcome. It's my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Stephen Meyer. I don't know, I wasn't listening too attentively to what Pastor Eric did, but just to give you some background, got his PhD in the philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge, little university over in England. A former geophysicist, college professor, and now directs the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. Author of several books, scientific journals and editorials that you can see the books out there in the lobby. And what an honor to have you, sir. Would you give me one more time, join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Meyer. I'm a little more nervous than usual in this interview because we're not talking theology. I was going to expand on the science of relativity, but I thought maybe I'd like to begin, Dr. Meyer, if you wouldn't mind, begin with a little bit of background on your faith journey and how it correlated to your interest in intelligent design and the field that you're in right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm speaking to the microphone. That's the Well, I'm honored to be here tonight and to have so many people turn out on a Sunday night. That's very, very kind and also impressive. You've got a great series going on here, I understand, with some of your previous guests. Well, I was raised in a sort of nominally Catholic home, and when our family stopped going to church in my early teen years, and I had just a kind of rough early adolescence where nothing seemed to be going right, and I found a lot of questions were popping into my mind that kind of frightened me a little bit, and quite a bit. One of the first ones was, what's it going to matter in 100 years? And I was actually listening to, I don't know if any of you have seen this new thing that's online, the Bible Project. And there was a very interesting one today that I was listening to about the book of Ecclesiastes. And that's kind of where I was. I couldn't make, there was a routine to life, and I said, where is this all heading? It didn't seem to make sense. And I had thoughts about time that bothered me. It seemed to, one moment, I could move something on the stage or set something down and pick it up. Now that was an event. Where did that event go? It's already gone. And I thought there must be something that doesn't change, because everything's changing all the time. And if everything's changing all the time, it has no lasting meaning or value or substance. And so and one day while I was having all these strange thoughts, I had another thought, which was, I wonder if this is what it means to be insane. And I remember to this day the surge of adrenaline I felt when that maybe there's something wrong with me. And I couldn't answer these questions. I talked to my mom about them, and she said, well, I think it's just adolescence. And that's probably true, but that wasn't the whole answer, at least at that time. And so, I mean, by and by, I had part of the problem too is I had broken my leg and a skiing accident, and my mind was just racing. I had no outlet for all that energy, and eventually some of this started to dissipate, and I started to read our big fat white Catholic family Bible, and I happened to open to the picture between the testaments, and there was a very rugged picture of Jesus saying, "Come unto me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And I thought that sounded pretty interesting. And I started reading the Gospel of Matthew. And I knew a bunch of kids in high school who were having really ecstatic, dramatic conversion experiences. And for me, as I read the Bible, I had to read one chapter every night, and it kind of settled my nerves and my hyperactive little brain. And it started to answer some of the big questions. I remember coming across the passage in Hebrews that said, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And I thought, that's it. There is something that doesn't change. And then the name of God in Exodus, the same, I am that I am. And so gradually, the worldview of the Bible started to address the questions I was having. When I got to college, I learned that they were philosophical questions. I had a wonderful philosophy mentor who later came and lived in this area, Norman Krebs. He was a pastor at one of the Presbyterian churches, Calvin Pres nearby, after he left Whitworth. And so in taking some of his courses, I realized that I had been asking philosophical questions that lots of people ask. I wasn't insane, although he did tell me that there was a fine line between insanity and philosophy. I needed to be careful. Anyway, so I had kind of a protracted conversion experience. It wasn't by any means a Damascus Road type of thing. Yeah. It took a while to get settled. It was more from philosophical things rather than scientific things that eventually led me to become convinced of the truth of Christianity. And I later learned about the scientific evidence for intelligent design when I was working in first job out of school.
So as you've worked on intelligent design and where did that first idea come from in you?
Well, I was working in the oil industry after I first graduated from college. I had, as what was called an exploration geophysicist. It was a very fancy title, and but I was looking at the seismic data that was coming in. So it was an early form of information technology. And I attended a conference in Dallas where I was working that was addressing the big questions at the intersection between science and philosophy, which was really kind of right up right up my street, as the British say. And there was a panel on the origin of the universe, one on the origin of life, and one on the origin and nature of the human mind, human consciousness. And it featured world-class scientists who had come from all around the world, who were either theists, people who believed in God, or atheist, agnostic, materialists who thought that matter and energy were the thing from which everything else came. And I was struck by the fact that it seemed to me clear that the theists seemed to have the intellectual initiative in the conversation. They were on the offense, and the atheists were on the defense. And this really surprised me, because I'd come out of a small Christian college and had the kind of intellectual insecurity that a lot of people do when they go to small religious colleges. And at this conference, there was a great cosmologist who spoke named Alan Sandage. And he announced at the conference that he had become a Christian. He was an longtime agnostic Jew by ethnicity, agnostic by belief, Jewish by ethnicity. And he gave a lecture on the evidence for the beginning of the universe, for the fact that the universe had a beginning, much of which he had helped to establish as first as a graduate assistant of Edwin Hubble, the great astronomer, and then as the leading astronomer astrophysicist at the observatory there in Southern California. And it was just a fascinating talk. But he was announcing a intellectual and also personal religious conversion from agnosticism or materialism to theism. And he explained how the evidence from science had led him to that point of view. Then in a subsequent panel, there was a discussion of the idea of intelligent design, though it wasn't called that yet. It was a panel about the origin of the first life, and a leading evolutionary theorist, a man named Dean Kenyon, announced that he no longer accepted his own theory of how the first life began from simpler non-living chemicals. It's called chemical evolution in the literature. And he had at the time, he was the author or co-author of the best-selling graduate level textbook advancing a chemical evolutionary. It was thought to be the best theory of how we got from the chemicals in the soup to an actual living cell. And he announced that he no longer accepted his own theory. And for him, the problem was the code that had been discovered inside the DNA molecule, which he thought pointed to some kind of master intelligence. He said there was a need to think about an intelligent cause of what we were seeing in the complexity and the information stored in life. And that was the first exposure I had to the idea of intelligent design. In the immediate aftermath of that conference, I met one of the other scientists on the panel who also agreed with Kenyon, and he began to mentor me. His name was Charles Thaxton.
What are some of the biggest discoveries in the last 50, 60 years that have added fuel to the discussion of intelligent design, to the argument?
Well, in biology, I would point to three. The first is that we've all learned about DNA in high school science, but we sometimes the really important thing about DNA is elided or skated over real quickly in the presentation. DNA contains information in a digital form. And if we were doing a science talk, I'd put a little picture of the formula for the DNA, the structural formula, but it's always represented as a double helix, and then on the inside of the molecule are these chemical parts or subunits, and we label them with letters, A, C, G, and T. And Watson and Crick discovered the structure of the DNA molecule, the helix, in 1953, but in 1957, Francis Crick put forward a famous hypothesis that's now known as the sequence hypothesis. It's been supported and confirmed by a wealth of evidence, and the idea was that DNA, that those little subunits of the DNA are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text, or like the zeros and ones in a section of software. In fact, our local hero here in the Seattle area, Bill Gates' DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. And that suggests the need for a master programmer. In addition, we've discovered little tiny miniature machines inside cells, sliding clamps and rotary engines and turbines and little walking robotic motor proteins that tow vesicles of material along what are functioning like railroad tracks inside the cell. In our cells, we have essentially an automated factory that is being directed by digital information. I sometimes use the analogy to what's going on at Boeing or any one of our great manufacturing companies in this area, where we use a technology called CAD/CAM, Computer Assisted Design and Engineering, where an engineer will sit at a console, write some code, the code will go down a wire, that code will be translated into a machine code that can be read at a manufacturing center, and if you're at Boeing, that information will say, put the rivets on the airplane wing as it's being constructed in just the right places. Well, that's very closely analogous to what's going on inside the cell. We have digital information constructing the parts of these miniature machines in an automated, unbelievably complicated way. It's just awesome. So we've got miniature machines, we've got digital code, we've got a complex information transmission and information storage, transmission, and processing system. And then as animals are developing, the scientists at Caltech investigating that process have discovered a form of circuitry that's controlling the flow of information in the way in which certain genes are turned on and turned off at the right time. So as different cells differentiate into muscles and bone and skin, they get the right proteins turned on at the right time. And when they map the system that controls all that, it looks like an integrated circuit. We know where those come from engineers. So there's just a pile of really interesting evidence. And it's the kind of thing, one of my colleagues, Michael Denton, who wrote one of the first great books, it was a book called Evolution, a Theory in Crisis, 1985. It was a seminal book in our movement. And he says that the thing about biology is that what we're learning is that we have wheels within wheels within wheels within wheels of inexhaustible complexity. So the individual wheels have design characteristics that remind us of our own engineering, but in life, it's an interdependency that is almost infinite or inexhaustible in every part is cause and effect of something else, and it's truly awesome.
So before this discovery, the notion, as I understand it, was that we went from simplicity, that out of the primordial soup came a simple cell, and we went from simplicity developing more complexity in creation as time. So you needed a whole lot of time for that to happen, but that's all been set on its head now, right?
Well, that's a really good way to describe the Darwinian or materialistic approach to explaining origins. You start with the very simplest thing, eternally far back in the past. Instead of in the book of John, we have in the beginning, God said, or, well, that's Genesis, let there be light, or in the beginning was the Word. In the materialistic worldview, it's from eternity past were the particles. And the particles arranged themselves into more complex chemicals, and the chemicals arranged themselves and eventually became a cell. And that simple cell gradually morphed and changed to become all the forms of life we see today. So that's the grand materialistic evolutionary story. The origin of life problem has turned that on its head, because even the very simplest cells are complex on a scale and in a manner we never anticipated. Darwin had no inkling of this. In the 1860s and 70s, some of his great proponents, Ernst Haeckel and Thomas Henry Huxley, espoused to something called the protoplasmic theory of life. And their idea was that life in its essence is an enclosure with a little bit of goo inside. Haeckel said the cell was a simple homogeneous globule of undifferentiated protoplasm. Well, that looks really simplistic in retrospect. Those are the smartest scientists of the 19th century, and they just completely got it wrong. The simplest thing was immensely complex, and complex not in the sense of just a scatter of random stuff, like throwing a bunch of letters on a Scrabble board, but complex in the sense of the letters spell something, and they're part of this larger integrated system of information storage and processing. So we start with complexity in the beginning. And then in the fossil record, we have instances not of gradual transitions to new, fundamentally new forms of life, but of big bursts of innovation that arise very suddenly. So the first book I wrote was about the origin of life, how we get complexity right from the beginning and even the simplest cell. Second book was about the origin of the animals that first come in the fossil record in an event called the Cambrian explosion, where they burst onto the scene in a very narrow window of geologic time with no discernible ancestors in the earlier Precambrian strata. And that's a pattern we see over and over again in the fossil record. The sudden appearance of new form, slight variations within the kind of frame of that form, variations on a theme, but the major innovations always come abruptly in the fossil record. So the Darwinian picture was that of a great branching tree from the simple cell at the base and all the big forms of life, or all the forms of life we see today at the top, and that little simple cell was thought to gradually morph and change over time. We don't see that gradual change. We see big bursts. And first animals, the first sea reptiles, the first winged insects, the first flowering plants, the first mammals, everything in these big bursts. So,
wow. Why do you think the Academy has worked so hard to, it seems to me, almost deny these discoveries, or at least, I know you've said before that these discoveries don't prove that there is a God, or prove the existence of the God of the Bible. But why has there been so much denial when the evidence seems to be mounting?
Well, all of us can adopt some kind of a worldview to make sense of the world around us. And at the end of the 19th century, with Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection and similar theories that were advancing a more naturalistic worldview, theories about the origin of the solar system, theories about coming into geology, about the origin of the great features on planet Earth. And then other major thinkers like Marx, who had a materialistic utopian vision of the future, and Freud, who had he's early 20th century, but he formulates a theory of the human condition and the human psyche that addresses the question what to do about human guilt. If you think about that, Darwin tells us where we came from, Marx tells us where we're going, he's got an eschatology, a secular eschatology, and then you have Freud addressing questions of human guilt, and those answer all the big questions that Judeo-Christian religion had always answered. And that becomes kind of the default worldview of intellectuals throughout the 20th century. And so that, when you have a comprehensive worldview that seems to answer all the big questions, you're a little loath to give it up over a simple matter of evidence, and so as these discoveries, really unexpected discoveries, have come online, and the big three that I focus on in my new book, Return to the God Hypothesis, are that the universe had a beginning. And that contradicts the materialistic view that from eternity past were the particles. The universe has been fine-tuned against all odds and for no underlying physical reason to allow for the possibility of life. That was a shocking discovery to many physicists in the 1950s and 60s. One of the scientists who discovered that had a complete about-face on worldview. He was a very staunch atheist. His name was Fred Hoyle. He'd opposed the discovery of the beginning of the universe, the Big Bang Theory, because he thought it had theistic implications, and he was a committed materialist. But then he made a discovery himself that the universe was finely tuned, and he changed his mind. And then the stuff in biology has just been mind-blowing. Nobody expected this. The great scientific atheist Richard Dawkins, who's written The God Delusion and The Blind Watchmaker and other books like that, has said that the universe has exactly the properties we should expect if at bottom there's no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, blind materialistic processes. Well, none of these things that have been discovered were expected on a materialistic worldview. And so it's when you have a worldview where people are really set and it seems to make sense of everything, and then there's just, the evidence starts to pile up, it's sometimes hard to shift gears, especially if it's functioning at a deep level as a kind of religion. And I have a friendly debating partner with whom I've done a number of debates and conversations, Michael Ruse. And he's a professor at Florida State. He's a British professor who came to the United States. And he's written an important book where he says that Darwinism has functioned as a kind of creation story, a secular creation story for many proponents of the theory. Now, he's a committed Darwinist, but he acknowledges that it's providing a kind of almost religious answers. And of course it does. It tells us where we came from. So it's providing that creation story. And therefore, because it has a deep religious function for many scientists, it's like any of us, if our core beliefs are challenged, we can get a little defensive. So.
Yeah. we talked before coming out. I shared with you the story of Vanessa, our eldest daughter, when she was at Shoreline Community College doing Running Start. And one of the first courses she took was a geology course, about 20, 30 students in the class. And the professor came out and asked, first thing he did when he walked in the classroom, I want to know, are there any Christians in the class? And I think Vanessa and one other girl had the courage to raise their hands. And then he said to them, I want you to know I'm going to demolish your faith in this semester. Well, she's sitting on the front row and is a pastor here in the congregation, so I don't think he succeeded. But talk to us about what's happening in the universities.
This is a far more, I hear stories like this all the time, and some of them sound hyperbolic to the agnostic, they can't. It's as aggressive as that sometimes. It's even more dangerous though when the professors are not that aggressive. When students feel like all reasonable people agree, it's unstated, it's assumed, the kind of beliefs you have are just beyond the pale of consideration. And so that's a challenge too. And I think it's really important that young people are equipped with what I call reasons for faith. They need to know why, not just what they believe, but why they believe it. And there is so much evidence and so many powerful reasons for adopting a theistic view of the universe, the origin of the universe, the origin of life, but also a biblical and a Christian view, in my view. But culturally, this is a very significant thing that's taking place. The pollsters are picking this up. They call it the rise of the nuns, not little ladies in habits, but the religiously non-affiliated or unaffiliated young people, and roughly 18 to 31 or 18 to 33. In that age group, there's been a big shift in the population in recent years towards agnosticism or even atheism. And when we've polled young people in that group, we found, and we drilled down, what are the reasons that people are either abandoning the faith of their youth or refusing to consider it? The number one reason that's offered is no scientific evidence for God. Second is theories of evolution, theories of undirected evolution. A distant third in one survey was problem of pain and suffering in the world. So you get a picture of fairly affluent young people who have been intellectually challenged in a way that leaves them disinclined to even consider faith. And yet, as I said just a minute ago, the big discoveries that have been made in the last 100 years in science about the beginning of the universe, about the universe having a beginning, about the universe being exquisitely finely tuned for life, about the complexity of life, all these things, I think, point in a decidedly theistic direction. So this is not the time to give up. We should not be on the defense, we should be on the offense. And so, and I think we need to do a better job of conveying some of this to young people so that they get to hear the other side of the argument.
Yeah. One of the missions of Discovery Institute, as I understand, is to provide those kinds of materials for young people.
Absolutely, and we have many. And Andrew McDermott, who was a former congregant here before he moved a fair bit away, is in the back at the end of this. This isn't a service, this is a conversation.
That's right.
Okay. So anyway, he can direct people to things that might be helpful in answering some of those questions with young people.
Yeah.
I know you and I both admire the Oxford professor John Lennox, and one of the things that Professor Lennox says is we're losing our young people because we're not answering their questions.
Yeah.
And I agree with that. I also think it's even a matter of equipping them to go on the offense because the evidence is that powerful. That gates of hell metaphor in the Bible, that's a defensive metaphor. The gates of hell don't come at us, they're stationary.
Yes.
That implies we should be on the offense. We have the truth and we have good reasons to believe it.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. That is amazing. How would a Christian open a discussion with these folks who are on the offensive and put us on the defensive? Where would we begin?
Well, this is a difficult question to answer. It's context dependent. There's a concept in rhetoric called casuistry. It means case-by-case reasoning. And I found as a young person, I was a very bad sharer of my faith, because I'd always answer the question the person wasn't asking, or I'd talk way too long, and you can't imagine how I would do that. I can see. And it took me a while to figure out that a really key thing is to listen and to find out where somebody's coming from, what their issues are. And sometimes the questions or objections people have to considering faith are ones that I'm not personally, or a person isn't equipped to answer. So one of the best things to do is to acquaint yourself with the kind of range of materials that are out there. One really nice set of books that I think are really user-friendly, easy to share, are the books by Lee Strobel, Case for Creator, Case for Christ, Case for Faith. And he interviews a bunch of experts in those books, but he's got a talent for storytelling, so they're easy to share with somebody to get a conversation going. I think it's a lot of times it's really depends on the relationship you have with the person. If you sense a person's open and they're genuinely seeking, then that invites one kind of conversation. Would you be? I've thought about that too. Would you be? I've read a book that I think addresses some of those things. Would you be interested in reading it and then going to coffee to talk about it? That might be one way. If somebody wants to debate, I have no problems with that. That can be really fun too. But
for you, maybe.
But yeah, the question is, is the person really interested, or are people just wanting to score points?
Yeah.
We had a pastor when we were in England, a brilliant guy, who told the story of the Christians coming to his door when he was a PhD student at a very prestigious British university. And he had so much fun debating with them at the door. And till one of his, but he was not interested. He just enjoyed the debating. Until one of his professors said, well, if you really want to, take them to task when they come, you ought to read their Bible. Because and then he gave a sermon, he said, that was my mistake.
Yeah. So let's jump to something we were talking about before coming out here, and that is that as a pastor, just watching the debate of creation within Christian circles, a lot of the battles have been around time. Genesis 1:1, is there a gap between Genesis 1:1 and the rest of, just trying to make sure that the book of Genesis is intact. Yeah. And you had some interesting responses to that I wasn't expecting.
Well, the first thing, I'll put on a couple of different hats, but just as the director of a center that sponsors lots of scientific research on the topic of intelligent design, we're officially not interested in that question. Well, or we're age neutral. The question that we're very interested in is the claim that the Darwinists have made for a long time. Richard Dawkins says that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And the key word for him is appearance, right? It's an illusion to the Darwinists. Things look designed, but they're not really designed. Why? Because there's an unguided, undirected mechanism known as natural selection, acting on random mutations, that can produce the appearance of design without being designed or guided in any way. And we wanted to challenge those guys about that and say, no, we think that life looks designed because it really is designed, and you can tell. And the Darwinian mechanism is not adequate to produce some of the most striking appearances of design, like those miniature motors or the digital code that I was talking about earlier. So for us, the key issue has been design or no design. And that's a surrogate for a bigger question about which worldview makes more sense, materialism or theism. And we think that's the really fundamental question, God or no God, God or matter. What is the thing from which everything else comes? So while we've been while this debate about young earth or old earth creationism or theistic evolution has raged in the church, we've given these rascals on the other side a pass. They've had a weak hand, but they've been announcing to the world that science properly understood undermines belief in God. And we've been arguing with ourselves about how long ago creation took place, not defending the fact that it really did take place and that there really is God the creator. Yeah. And so we've tried to reframe this for that reason, because we think the wrong issue has been joined, and also to calm down the conversation in the Christian world, because it got toxic at some point. And I was invited one time to a creation conversation and asked to explain how people of goodwill could come to a different view of a controversial evidence because of how you might weigh evidence differently. And so I gave my little talk as a philosopher of science on that topic. But when the conversation between the old earth people and the young earth people got done, I realized they didn't need a philosopher of science, they needed a marriage counselor, So we've tried to say this is an interesting issue, but it's not the central issue, and we shouldn't be breaking, within the Christian world, we shouldn't be breaking fellowship over this, or saying some of the nasty things we say about each other when we have differences of that. My closest colleague in the ID movement has a different view about that than I do. His name is Paul Nelson. And we tried to argue about it one time, but we got bored. Because we just think there's more important things at stake. Yeah. Having said all that, I'll tell you my view if you want to know. I think that the evidence for a very ancient universe and Earth the scientific evidence is very strong. But I'm also intrigued with how much evidence there is for a fairly recent origin of anatomically modern man, our species. There's something in the archaeological and even fossil record called the Big Bang of human cultural evolution. And you have things like the oldest cities, the most ancient writing, the advent of agriculture. These are all very, very recent compared to the story we're told about evolutionary anthropology. So I have a kind of hybrid view of old Earth, recent humans. And I think one thing that's important to say, I personally do not think the Bible teaches a young Earth. And for me, the critical issue is the day 4 part of creation. When you get to day 4, we're told that God either created or caused to appear. The verb there is haya, and it admits either meaning. But the sun and the moon, and they're given as markers of the days, the years, and the seasons. So in other words, the time markers are not on the scene until we've already had 3 yoms, 3 days of creation. The days of creation have already been established. And so there's a Bible scholar, Jack Collins, he's a Hebrew scholar, Hebrew philologist, and he's asked, are the days of creation young Ken Ham days or old Hugh Ross days? And he says neither. They're days of indeterminate length from a human point of view. We don't have time markers when the days of creation are established, and yet there's a time sequence. And so we've got to be careful not to impute our sort of, first pass meaning of the text. We read the text, day must mean 24 hours. Well, we don't have a way of marking 24 hours in the days of creation as they're established. So
until day 4.
Until day 4. But by that time, the yom already has a definite meaning. There's a beginning and an end to each yom, and it has nothing to do with 24 hours. So I just think we got to be careful. I think that means the Bible admits we've had this ancient concept of the 2 books of creation, or the 2 books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature. And I think it's fair to look to nature to answer the question, how old is the earth? And I think there the evidence is pretty strong that it's very old. But I also think it's curious that the evidence for us is not of very ancient.
Yeah.
The earliest writing is of the Sumerians. It's not even 6,000 years old. The earliest cities are about the same age, 5,500 years. Agriculture since the last ice age, 11 or 12,000 years. There's some interesting things to think about there. So.
Yeah. So after all of your discovery, scientific exploration, you don't see a conflict between the discoveries that are being made and what the Bible records, even though understanding the issue of time.
Oh, no, I see a tremendous convergence. Yeah. The first words of the Bible are in the beginning. This is the big discovery of modern cosmology, and a very surprising one, that the universe had a beginning. And so I think, and there's a sequence of events in Genesis that lines up very nicely with what we know scientifically about, from the fossil record and from geological history. So I think I see a convergence of testimony there. And then we were talking before about one of your passions, archaeology, and the extensive corroboration of the historical reliability of the Bible from Genesis to Jesus. I mean, in each period of biblical history, there's just more and more being uncovered that establishes the reliability of the text. So I think there's a strong evidential case to be made for the faith that we hold, for the biblical faith.
The new book, the book you've just written on this subject, some of the information in there would that be for scientists, or do you think a layperson could grapple with these issues?
Do you remember watching cartoons with your kids when they were little, and how there was one level of humor that the kids were reacting to, and then there was a second level for the parents, with the double entendre or whatever. My books they're fat, but I write them with, I try to teach the science that people need to understand the argument I'm making as I go along. And I often use stories and illustrations. Some of the illustrations I used to use when I was a college professor, and I'll just describe them. Or we have Andrew helped me with a lot of the securing the photos and the illustrations. And so I try to hit a seam. The books are not published with an academic press. And instead, they're with a trade press, Harper One. And Harper One is the imprint. They call it a high-tone trade. It's the seam between an academic press and a trade book. So they're documented, lots of footnotes and all that if you're into that. But I think most people, inquiring minds, I've written them for intelligent lay people who want to learn the science that's relevant to the question, what can science tell us about the reality of God or not?
Yeah. Can you talk for just a moment? I know when we have your friend, the archaeologist here, we'll go into a little bit further, but I was intrigued by your comments about the discoveries in Sudan, northern Sudan.
Oh, yeah.
Right now.
Well, we have a young archaeologist on our research, among our research fellows. His name is Titus Kennedy, and he has recently made an expedition to northern Sudan, where there was an early report, uncorroborated, of an inscription on a very ancient Egyptian monument. So very northern Sudan was very southern Egypt in biblical times. And there's an inscription from the pharaoh who would have been alive around the time of 1410, 1420, something like that, which would correspond in the biblical chronology to the time of the wandering period between the escape from Egypt and the entrance into Canaan by the Israelites. And Titus took an expedition there. He promised us he'd take appropriate security. He didn't. He's a very fearless young guy. And anyway, the inscription, he found the inscription and the monuments. And the inscription is the earliest mention of the Hebrew God Yahweh. And it is in the context of a narrative that describes the movements of the Tashasu Yahweh, the nomads of Yahweh, as they are entering into Moab and Edom. Now, those are the countries on the east side of the Jordan where they would have encamped before entering into Canaan, into the Promised Land. And so what you have is a contemporaneous Egyptian description of the movement of the Israelites during the wandering period after they've left Egypt and before they enter Canaan. And when you put that in context of other things that have been discovered establishing the presence of the Israelites in Egypt prior to the biblical date for the Exodus, which Titus and I take to be the date you can calculate from the Old Testament chronologies, which is 1446-ish BCE. And then the time at which they should have entered, about 1410, 1406, something like that. And then after that, there's extensive evidence of the presence of Israelites in Canaan, and that they become the dominant people group very soon afterwards. So you have a kind of a picture of the evidence. If you put it on a map, you've got Israelites at time A, or at point A, time 1, prior to the biblical date, where they're supposed to be in Egypt. Then they get to Canaan at point B, time 2, and you've got evidence of them there. And now we even have evidence of them on the route between A and B. So you have to take the historicity of the Exodus account now pretty seriously, because that's a pretty thorough That's a very, very extensive corroboration of the account archaeologically. It's amazing.
Yeah.
So.
No, it's fascinating to me to hear you. I'm not obviously nearly familiar enough as I should be with the natural sciences and cosmology that you describe. But when you watch the confluence of all of those with archaeological discoveries and some of the other sciences, it really seems like the closer we get to the return of Christ, whenever that's going to be, the greater the level of evidence for our faith. It should be hugely reassuring for the people of God.
That's a really poignant and perceptive observation. I was telling, I had an office mate when I was a PhD student in Cambridge, and I was telling him about some of this Exodus evidence, and he knew about the stuff I work on intelligent design and stuff, and he said that gives me a really eerie feeling, Meyer, because it feels like God is just pulling the curtain back for our very skeptical age. Titus was on the, we had a Discovery Institute tour of Israel in fall of 19 with Michael Medved, another local hero here in Seattle. And we went to the Israel Museum, and you have there, behind one piece of glass, you've got the Caiaphas burial crypt, which has been discovered. You have the Pilate stone, which is an inscription that Pilate had made, giving tribute to Tiberius Caesar, that was discovered at Caesarea Maritima. And you have just that one little snapshot of history. The first century Roman Praetorium is discovered, where the trial of Jesus was held. You have equal amounts of evidence for many of the important Old Testament events. The story of Hezekiah in the Bible has been extensively corroborated. The water tunnel that Hezekiah had dug has been discovered. It's bullae, signet rings with 2 or 3 bullaes, even one that was properly provenanced with Hezekiah's name on it. You should get Titus to come. It's a whole evening in its own right. Yeah.
Well, one of the whole reasons for having Dr. Meyer here is to just provide opportunities for you to ask questions and to understand that there is reason for your faith. And the enemy is coming against that at every opportunity. And actually sending our kids to secular universities is just a huge gamble that we're taking, because it seems that the focused agenda is their indoctrination rather than their education. And our greatest fear is that we would lose the entire generation of young people because we put them in harm's way without having access to the kind of evidence that Dr. Meyer is talking about, and is readily available, and a growing, mounting evidence for the existence of God. Now, because these sciences are not my field, I have exhausted all of my questions.
Thought you did very well, Pastor.
Rather than continuing to get the deer in the headlights look here, I wonder if we don't take our break early, because there may be many of you that we have a lot of questions. Oh, hallelujah. So let's take a 10-minute break, and if you've not asked your question yet, please text that into us, and please stop at the table in the lobby so you can see Discovery Institute's resources that are available for you, so that you can help guide your young people, so you can have peace of mind, and you can help guide your young people through the pitfalls ahead. All righty? God bless you. We'll see you in 10 minutes. 15.
All right, welcome back from intermission. We'll give folks just a quick moment to filter back in from the lobby, give you a moment to find your seats, and we'll get into our question and answer time momentarily. As you are finding your seats, I failed to mention one of the booths we have in the lobby, and if I don't, my fob to the building will not work when I come to work on Tuesday. So we have an accredited undergraduate degree program here called the Forge in partnership with Northwest University at about a third the price. There's about 10 fully accredited undergraduate degree tracks, communications, psychology, ministry, and the most fascinating part about it that Evan, my colleague, one of the pastors, worked so hard to facilitate, and that's unique to this as opposed to like being an on-site student, is the internship opportunities. There's opportunities to be behind the scenes with pastoral staff at Westgate in different ministry positions, with business people in the community, an emerging partnership with Spirit 1053 for communications majors. So not only do you get an undergraduate degree at a third the price, but you also come out of school with resume experience, which is really, really awesome. So there's just some basic information. The Forge, it's just straight back on the other side of that wall, off to the right a little bit. So I encourage you to check out that table in addition to the other two out there. And we have always, from the inception of Apologia, our desire has always been to provide this to the community for free of charge. So if you didn't know, Apologia runs entirely off of donations. So that said, we deeply appreciate whatever you would feel led to contribute tonight. The instructions for that will pop up on the screen. We'll leave that up for a few moments so you can see how you can contribute to us. You can imagine the expense involved with bringing guests of this caliber on a monthly basis really do add up. So we really sincerely appreciate your help in facilitating that so that we never have to charge, and this just remains free and accessible to anyone who would care to come. Okay, so with that said, we do have a lot of questions. Pastor Alec and Dr. Myers will do their best to get to as many of them as they can. So let's welcome them back, and let's, hold that. As Apologia happens every month, we have got quite a few coming down the pipeline. So we've got a quick video just to give you the speakers, little sound bites, and the dates, so you can get those on your calendars, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Okay.
We need to continue to speak truth. We need to resist this cancel culture. And as I mentioned in Jeremiah, Jeremiah is amazing, just an amazing prophet. And they tried to cancel him multiple times. But God said, look, I'm going to make you a bronze wall. They will not be able to take you out. You just continue to proclaim truth and do what I tell you to do, say what I tell you to say, and I'm going to take care of you. And that's the same thing that Jesus said, that I am with you always, even unto the end of the age. The church is going to prevail. The church of Jesus Christ will prevail. We are on the winning side. We just have to follow the Lord, be obedient to the Lord, and allow Him to bring about the results in His time.
Nature abhors a vacuum. And so the left, the atheists, they can't wait to kick the biblical view out of the public square, because they plan to bring a completely different religion in, whether it's the religion of atheism or any other kind of religion. They're definitely going to fill the void, and that's why it's up to us to defend the faith and contend for the faith. This nation, as you know from David Barton, was built upon a biblical worldview, a Judeo-Christian foundation. We need to stand on that foundation. We have hundreds of years of prayers of believers who have gone for us, who have prayed for this nation, built this nation, poured their life out for this nation. Why in the world would we stand back and let these people steal this, the most magnificent nation that's ever been on earth? Why would we allow them to steal it out from under us and our children?
When you realize that your faith is not only rational, but it is atheism that is irrational, when you begin believing that stuff and seeing that that's a fact, it changes your walk. You don't walk around saying, well, I just got something spiritual I want to share with you. All truth is one. The Lord created the world of science. The Lord created history. And some of that is catching up. And I think believers need to be emboldened, especially in these dark times, that the God we worship, he's the God of every part of the universe, every scientific discipline, every moment in history. The more you know, the more it emboldens you, because we need to be really bold in our faith.
And in case they are, oh, there they are. Well, let's welcome them.
We have some great questions here. We should have gone to yours first, I think. It was great. Thank you.
Just glad they all came back.
That's right. So the first question that I'd like you to address for us is, when you mention going on the offensive, what are the top 3 discoveries and facts that you lean on that point to a creator?
Well, I mentioned them in our conversation before in passing. There are 3 huge discoveries about the origin of the universe and the origin of life that have been made in the last 100 years. The first is that the universe, as best we can tell, had a beginning. The physical universe of matter, space, time, and energy had a beginning. The second is the discovery that from the beginning of the universe, the fundamental parameters of physics have been finely tuned against all odds. That is, they've been improbably finely tuned to allow for the possibility of life, suggesting a fine tuner. And then the third discovery is the discovery of the complexity of the cell, and in particular, the informational endowments of the DNA molecule and the whole system that exists in the cell for information storage, transmission, and processing. In addition, we could talk some of the other aspects of the complexity of life that we were talking about, the little miniature machines and the circuitry and so forth. Now, one of the questions that related to this was, well, what is meant exactly by fine-tuning? And it might be helpful to talk a little bit about that. By fine-tuning, the physicists mean that there are these basic physical parameters, like the strength of gravitational attraction, or the force that is pushing the universe outward. We live in an expanding universe. Or the masses of the elementary particles, the quarks and the electrons and so forth, all have a just right character. They fall within very narrow ranges, such that if the force of gravity were a little stronger, a little weaker, if the force pushing the universe out were a little stronger, a little weaker, if the mass of the electron were a little heavier, a little lighter, or the quark, the universe could not support life. We couldn't even get basic chemistry off the ground. And the probability of getting even just one of these parameters, right? They all have different the probabilities associated with each of them are different, but most of them are extremely small. The probabilities are extremely small. For example, what's called the cosmological constant, which is the outward pushing force that's counteracting gravity and causing our universe to expand, is thought by most physicists to be finely tuned about 1 part in 10 to the 90th power. So that'd be like looking for one marked atom in our galaxy. No, not in our galaxy, in our whole universe. Our whole universe has 10 to the 80th elementary particles. So it'd be like floating out in the universe with a blindfold on, hoping to find that one elementary particle that was marked, but only you don't get to just look in our universe, because it could be in any one of 10 billion universes our size. That's the degree of improbability associated with getting the parameter right. Or another way to think of it is the degree of fine-tuning, okay, the precision required to get a universe that will not either collapse back on itself or experience what physicists call a heat death, where everything dissipates so quickly. And that's just one of the parameters. So time and time again, you have these physical parameters that have this just right quality. And so sometimes the physicists actually say we live in a Goldilocks universe. or one book calls it the fortunate universe. And many of these parameters were set from the very beginning of the universe, so we don't have just evidence of design that comes online long after the beginning, but also from the very beginning. And then if we also think a bit more about that discovery of the universe having a beginning, how consequential that is, because what the physicists are telling us is that the picture of the universe we get is one of the universe beginning from what's called a singularity of where matter and energy, but also space and time come into existence. And there's an ancient argument that goes like this: whatever begins to exist must have a cause. The cause must, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe must, therefore the universe must have a cause, and since causes are separate from their effects, the cause of the universe must be separate from the universe. But it also must not be material, because it's matter and energy that came into existence at the beginning. So we need a transcendent immaterial cause to explain the origin of the universe, and also a cause which is capable of initiating a great change of state from nothing to everything physical, which suggests a volitional act. So when you start weighing, when you look at the evidence that we have, the fine-tuning suggests the fine-tuner, the Big Bang suggests some transcendent cause beyond the universe, and then the digital information in life suggests a master programmer, but not one that could only be operating at the beginning or down the line. You need something to cause the universe to begin. So it couldn't just be a space alien, because the space alien exists within the universe after the universe has come into existence and after the laws of physics have been finely tuned. So when you start adding it all up, it's really only theism that makes sense of this. Deism doesn't work, because the deistic God acts only at the beginning, but we got evidence of design down the timeline. So the space alien is an inadequate explanation because it doesn't explain the beginning. The deistic creator is an inadequate explanation because it doesn't explain the design that happens after the beginning. The pantheistic creator of the Eastern philosophies doesn't work because pantheism thinks of God as coextensive with matter. God is in the matter is in God, but God is not a mind or an intelligence. And also, if God is in the matter, then if the matter comes into existence a finite time ago, before that, there's no God to do the causing, just as there's no matter to do the causing in materialism. So you kind of, I do a kind of, in the book, a game of, what's that? Survivor, where you get kicked off the island. It's a worldview survivor game. And I just look at the different worldviews, and it turns out when you examine them carefully, it's really only classical theism which asserts the existence of a transcendent, intelligent creator who also acts, who is active in the creation, that explains the whole range of evidence. Wow. So that's the argument.
That's awesome. That is awesome. Next question. Science has a requirement for experiments to be reproducible. Does intelligent design require interventions that can't be reproduced and therefore can't be classified as science?
Yes, this is a very common, the question is a great question, and it reflects a common objection that's posed to the case for intelligent design, and that is, it's not science because fill in the blank, because it invokes an unobservable entity. Well, but quarks are not observable, and the fundamental forces of physics are not observable, and subsurface geological faults are not observable, and you infer the existence of things in science from things you can see, okay? Science involves making inferences from the visible to the invisible, from the seen to the unseen, from the observable to the unobservable. So that's one reason that's offered for intelligent design not being science. But if we can posit an unobservable Big Bang event or posit an unobservable transitional intermediate in the fossil record, why can't we also posit an unobservable intelligence if intelligence provides the best explanation should such an entity exist? And that gets really segues to the person's question. Reproducibility is often cited as an important criterion of something being considered properly scientific. But there are branches of science that are concerned with singular events in the past. One of them is cosmology, another is archaeology. And all the historical sciences are trying to posit explanations for events in the past based on the effects we have left behind. This is what my PhD dissertation was about. It was entitled Of Clues and Causes. Okay, we have clues, we're trying to infer back to causes. So all the historical sciences involve events that are not reproducible under controlled laboratory conditions and under controlled conditions in the laboratory. Rather, they're one-time events that the existence of which we infer from the evidence of those events that's left behind, or else we might also try to infer the cause of those events from evidence that's left behind. So reproducibility is a standard that is sought in the experimental sciences, in laboratory physics or chemistry, but it's only indirectly relevant to discussions in the historical sciences. We want to know, based on our uniform and repeated experience, something about the cause and effect structure of the world. So that, in that sense, historical sciences are concerned with reproducibility, but we use that knowledge to infer one-time events. So we know from our uniform and repeated experience that only intelligent agents produce information, especially in a digital or alphabetic form, whether we're talking about Bill Gates' software code or hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book. So when we see information in DNA, using our uniform and repeated experience as the basis of our reasoning, we can say, well, the best explanation would be an intelligent cause, because we know that's the only kind of cause that is involved in producing information, but we also have inferred a singular event. So the point is, we use the same method of reasoning in reconstructing the past and making the case for intelligent design that the Darwinian scientists use in making their case for evolution. We're just as scientific as they are. The question is, in the sense of using the same method, the question is who's come to a better explanation? And that's really the issue, that what we're doing is we're using a method called inference to the best explanation, where the best explanation is one that cites a cause which is known to produce the effect in question. And it turns out that in our experience, the only known cause of a large amount of what's called specified information is a mind. That's the kind of information we have in code, in digital code, in software, or in a paragraph in a book, but it's also the kind of information that's in DNA. So we're using an established method of scientific reasoning, an historical method of scientific reasoning, and we think by using it, we've come to the best explanation.
Incredible. That's incredible.
That was a long answer, I'm very sorry. If I can just add, I'll add to that. Just for fun. This whole question of, is it science, is kind of a red herring. It's a distraction, right? What do we want to know about an idea? Do we want to know how to classify it? Or do we want to know whether it's true? Okay? The bottom line is, I don't really care if someone wants to say, well, that idea of intelligent design, that's metaphysics. That's philosophy. Well, yeah, metaphysics is the subject in philosophy that studies reality, what's really real. So yes, but lots of scientific theories are about what's really real. So just because you're metaphysical doesn't mean you can't also be scientific. And we've gotten all hung up on how to classify ideas instead of asking the question, are they true or not? And how do we determine whether something is true? Yeah. And so what we've argued is, well, okay, if you don't want to call our theory scientific, that's fine, but make sure, since we're using the same method that the Darwinists use, that you classify their theory as unscientific too, because we know what you're really trying to do. You're trying to stigmatize an idea by putting a pejorative label on it, rather than dealing with the truth claim and the evidence that we're marshaling in support of that truth.
Yeah. I've heard it said that the amount of time needed for evolution to occur is beyond the age of the earth, maybe the universe. Is that still a valid argument against evolution, that there just isn't enough time for it to occur?
Actually, it's an increasingly valid objection to standard neo-Darwinian theories of biological origins. It's called, in the technical literature, it's called the waiting times problem. I deal with it in a chapter in Darwin's Doubt, and we have a very significant research program that we're advancing right now on this with a Swedish mathematician, a German paleontologist, and a former Smithsonian researcher in mathematical and other forms of biology. And here's the basic problem. there's a mathematical expression of what's called neo-Darwinism. That's the modern version of Darwin's theory that asserts that natural selection acting on random mutations is the mechanism that generates new biological form. And when that's expressed in a field called, there's a mathematical expression for those ideas in a field called population genetics, and the population genetics equations can basically tell you how much evolutionary change you would expect to occur in a given amount of time if you know the mutation rate, if you know something about the generation time, how long it takes from parents to offspring, and if you know something about the population sizes that you're looking at. And using those parameters, you can calculate how much evolutionary time should take place in a given amount of time, or conversely, how much time it should take for a given evolutionary innovation to occur. And so we've got this is a problem that's been acknowledged within evolutionary biology, that the time is not enough for many of the what are called anatomical characters to arise in the time allowed by the fossil record. We have a research team working on this. Richard Sternberg, you may have seen on the internet talking about this. He's done some really interesting calculations just about what's called the whale evolution. And there's so many new anatomical characters that arise when you try to make a land-dwelling animal into an aquatic mammal, and it's all supposed to happen within 11 million years, and we start quantifying the time needed for just 2 coordinated mutations, you get something like 43 million years, and yet you would need tens of thousands of anatomical innovations that would require many coordinated mutations. So the what's called the waiting times blow up exponentially. And this is even the case for protein-to-protein evolution, trying to get one new protein fold to form another one. And there's a waiting times problem even with that level of evolutionary transition, and that's one of our labs has worked on that. So this is actually a big problem that is one of the reasons that many evolutionary biologists are now calling for a new theory of evolution. They are acknowledging that the mutation selection mechanism lacks the creative power necessary to generate fundamental innovations, morphological changes of form, innovations in the history of life.
Related to that, can you talk about the missing link?
Well, I address, in my book, Darwin's Doubt, I look at 2 different mysteries that have confronted modern evolutionary biology. One is this pattern of abrupt appearance of new fossil forms in events like the Cambrian explosion or the mammalian radiation, with an absence of discernible connections to ancestral precursors. So in the Darwinian view, you start with that simple form at the base of the Darwinian tree, and then it morphs and changes gradually, and you should have a fine gradation of anatomical change from the simplest forms to the most complex over time, and that's what the fossil record we would expect should document. And time again, it does not. And so we don't have a missing link, we have a pattern, as Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge, 2 of the great paleontologists of the 1970s, 80s, 90s, explained. We have a pattern of abrupt appearance and stasis, where you get new forms of life arising without the antecedents, without the anatomical precursors in the fossil record, and then that basic form stays constant over geological time until it either gets to the present or it goes extinct. And they developed a whole different theory of evolution called punctuated equilibrium to deal with that pattern in the fossil record. And the great thing about punctuated equilibrium is that it did a better job of describing the pattern in the fossil record, but it did not have a mechanism that could produce that amount of change that quickly, and that's been the kind of catch-22 of evolutionary biology ever since. The Darwinian mechanism allegedly works slowly and gradually, but you don't see slow gradual change in the fossil record. The Punch-Eek mechanism was really inadequate at every level, but it didn't explain the abrupt change, and really nothing else has either.
Is there any indication as to how long humans have been around?
Well, that's something I personally am uncertain about. There's a very good essay by my colleague, Casey Luskin, in a book, Critiquing Theistic Evolution, in which he makes a very good case that the genus Homo, of which we're a part, arises very abruptly. And then also the Big Bang of cultural evolution, where we see evidence of higher cognition, representational art, agriculture, writing, cities. That stuff is all in much more recent, tens of thousands of years at the max. And in some of those questions, I think there are some legitimate debates about dating, and so I don't think we have an absolutely clear picture about that, but there's something very mysterious. If we'd been around for 2 million years, like some of the paleoanthropologists have asserted, and only gradually emerged, where was the evidence of higher cognition? Where was the evidence of writing or cities or agriculture? All that stuff is very recent. So I don't think we have a completely clear picture of that scientifically, but I think we have to take the archaeological evidence into account as well as the bones that have been found in various places, because I think there's more to human beings than bones.
Yeah. How many other scientists are in agreement regarding intelligent design?
I think that's fairly difficult to quantify. We keep pretty good tabs on our network of people that we know are sympathetic. And it's quite a bit more extensive than anyone would imagine if they read news reports. We have to be somewhat careful about protecting the identities of some of these folks because it's very controversial, and we do have a cancel culture. We like to say that we got canceled before getting canceled was cool, you know. I would say this: I'm extremely bullish about the future of this idea, concept, research program. I would call it a research program. Every good scientific research program offers an explanation for facts that we already have, and also begins to posit a theoretical framework that generates new testable hypotheses and expectations about what we ought to find as we do more experimental or field work or observational work. And we are supporting, and there are other research groups doing both of those types of things. They're showing that intelligent design provides a very good explanation for facts we already have, and they're using intelligent design to generate testable hypotheses, some of which, for example, the hypothesis that the junk DNA would turn out not to be junk, have been confirmed by more recent findings. So I think we have a very robust research program. It's attracting a lot of young talent. We have a summer program every year for young scientists, usually juniors, seniors in college, right up through postdoc years. So we get grad students and we have students coming from all over the world. We have more and more applicants every year. There's just a tremendous amount of energy around this idea.
What are the ranges of giftings and callings in your staff right now?
Well, we have people like my colleague Andrew McDermott, who's a good writer and an expert in social media, and we have a lot of people doing work with video production, but we have our core program is a scientific research program, so we have scientists, philosophers, historians of science in that program. And then we support external research projects. Right now we're supporting about 15 external research projects at major mainstream research universities around the world. And so this is a very dynamic, the media got out in front of this back in 2005, 2004. There was a controversial court trial in Dover, Pennsylvania, and the issue wasn't framed very well, and the trial was predictably lost. And our folks on the other side of the debate said it's over for intelligent design after Dover, ha, ha, ha. And we're now 16 years on from that, and we have some very prominent world-class scientists who are involved in the research effort. I got some amazing endorsements for the new book, including a Nobel laureate in physics from Cambridge University. So I don't think the attempt to stigmatize intelligent design as creationism in a cheap tuxedo, and I was really hurt by that comment because I paid good money for my tuxedo. But anyway, there was that sort of, ad hominem attack and ridicule, in the early days of this. I think we're well beyond that. So this is getting really interesting. And the other thing that's happening in a parallel track is that leading evolutionary biologists are acknowledging that neo-Darwinism is dead. So there's a prominent evolutionary biologist who was at a conference that I attended in London, 2016, with the Royal Society, on new trends in evolutionary biology. It was called by people in what are called the third way. They've rejected neo-Darwinism. They don't want to go to intelligent design. They're looking for a new theory of evolution. And one of the very prominent scientists there said, oh, critique of neo-Darwinism is so early 90s. You know, it's not just that the theory is passé, critiquing it is getting passé. Let's move on from that because we all know we need a new theory. Now that message is not getting out in any of the textbooks, but it's what's happening in the peer-reviewed literature.
Yeah.
So that's happening in parallel with the growth of the ID movement. I'd say that's getting pretty interesting.
Yeah, no kidding, no kidding. In fact, it may be highlighted by how bitter some of those scientists are getting. I mean, I'm thinking about some of the things Dawkins said and published, and there seems to be an angst in them.
Well, that hurt my feelings too, but we won't get into that. I know you do pastoral counseling, so we'll...
Can you describe the perfection of the galaxy and solar system necessary to sustain human life on Earth?
Well, this is another wonderful topic, and I can't do it justice, but I have two colleagues who have done. They've written a book called Privileged Planet. This is Guillermo Gonzalez and Jay Richards. There's also a nice documentary film by Illustra Media by the same title about this. And it turns out that just as the basic physical parameters of the universe are in that sweet spot, the Goldilocks, the Goldilocks universe, it turns out that we're in a Goldilocks zone in our solar system. The Earth is exactly the right distance from the sun. It's at exactly the right axial tilt. And our solar system is in a sweet spot within the galaxy. It's called I think if I can get the term of art, is a circumstellar habitable zone. And there's a narrow band within the galaxy where life would be sustainable. And the big surprise twist in the plot that they develop is that not only is our planet in the right part of the solar system to allow for the sustainability of life, and the galaxy in the right place our solar system in the right place in the galaxy for habitability, but we also are in the right place for discoverability. That in both cases, we're in just the right place that will allow us to make discoveries about the cosmos that God has created around us. And so the subtitle of their book is Privileged Planet, a Universe Designed for Discovery, which is a kind of a cool concept.
Yeah.
So I'd highly recommend that. And it's another, I don't even get into that design argument in the book because Jay and Guillermo did such a fine job, but that's an amazing insight.
Yes. What research or new findings have you the most excited as you look ahead?
Well, I'll answer that by telling a story. We have a really brilliant architect-level Microsoft engineer in Redmond who granted 2 years of his time to us, and he wrote 10,000 lines of code to help us portray the gene expression system in a computer domain that allowed, in turn, computational biologists to do experiments. And so you had to explain, he had to understand how the digital code in the DNA produced the messenger RNAs that in turn directed the construction of the proteins. It's called the gene expression system. One day he came into my office and threw a book down on my table. It was a book called Design Patterns. And he said, kind of dramatically, a big tall guy with a shock of Einstein-like hair, and he said, I get an eerie feeling that someone figured this out before us. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you, Steve, you're always going on about the digital code in DNA, but it's a much bigger story than that. He said, design patterns in computer science are established methods of storing and transmitting and processing information, digital information. And what I'm discovering as I'm having to write all this code about how the information is stored and processed inside the cell is there are multiple recognizable computer design patterns at work. And then he proceeds to tell me, on your laptop, you put your folders in your other folders and your files in your folders. And well, information is stored hierarchically in the same way in the cell. You've got files and folders and folders and super folders and super folders and super duper folders. And, on your, when you're using your word processor, if you make a mistake, then you can, you have a spell check you can use, you've got automated error correction in DNA replication. Wow. And you can, in cryptography, we can sometimes embed one message in another message if we're clever, if we cleverly shift the starting point of reading the message. Well, inside the cell, you've got messages layered on top of other messages. They're called overlapping genes. This is a sophisticated method of encryption, and that creates an immense capacity for data storage. And he went on and on and on about these design patterns. Well, the thing about design patterns is that we know of only one cause of these design patterns for processing digital information, and that's smart computer engineers. And then he gave me the kicker, which was, he said at the end, he said, so they have all the same features of the design patterns that we have in modern high-tech digital computing, except, and then he went into Microsoft speak, he said, except they're like 8.0, 9.0, 10.0 versions of the ones that we've designed. They vastly exceed our designs in their elegance. And that's the kind of thing we're discovering as we dig into the genome. My colleague Richard Sternberg is looking at this hierarchical processing of information and how the DNA is just part of the story. There's information that reads the DNA. In fact, what we thought was junk turns out to include the files for building the proteins, yes, but the part that wasn't building the proteins is functioning like an operating system that's turning on and turning off. It's directing the expression of the data files and turning them on and off at the right time. It's a hierarchical organization of information. So it's pretty awesome. Wow.
And to think that the New Testament says that without Christ, nothing existed, and he spoke these things into existence out of nothing. And that's the one who came to earth, took on human flesh, died on a cross in order to reconnect us with this amazing God. It's mind-blowing.
Well, and Pastor, something that I think is an interesting connection there is the first words of the John 9 prologue. In the beginning was the Word. And in one of the epistles, Jesus is referred to as the Word of Life. And this scientist, Dean Kenyon, that I mentioned, who first began to doubt his own chemical evolutionary ideas about the origin of life because of the discovery of information encoded in DNA, later he first had an intellectual conversion to skepticism about his own theory. Then eventually to embrace the theory of intelligent design, eventually to a theistic worldview, and he finally became a Christian. And he told me one of the things that sort of startled him was the description in the Bible of Christ as the creator, but also as the Word, as the source of information.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Please address the probability factors regarding optical isomers of amino acids and sugars in biological. I read this stuff all the time, people. Acids and sugars in biological systems, random genesis versus design.
Your daughter said to leave that one for you.
All right, let me handle this one.
I was tempted, Andrew knows this, I was tempted to bring a visual aid tonight, and now I wish I had. But I'm gonna ask you to use your visual imagination. This is a discussion, the question is about the probability of proteins arising by chance in a prebiotic environment, so an early ocean or a warm little pond. Proteins are the building blocks, not the building. Proteins are the tools of the cell. They do all the important jobs. They catalyze reactions at rates much faster than would be necessary or that would happen otherwise without them. They build the parts of the little miniature machines I was talking about. They process the information on the DNA strand. And every protein has a different shape. Just like in your toolbox, you'll have a wrench, a hammer, a saw, and the different shape of those tools will allow them to do different jobs. So proteins have these different shapes. Now they acquire those different shapes as a result of the subunits out of which they're made, called amino acids, lining up in exactly the right sequence. And there are 20 different protein-forming amino acids. So at each linkage, a functional protein on average has about 300 of these amino acids. And then if they're arranged properly, they'll fold into a shape that will allow the protein to do a job. So when I lecture to college students, I use one of those snap lock beads that kids use to illustrate this, and they click together, and some of them are blue and red and purple, and some are little accordions, or some are rectangular. Well, that's a good, roughly idea. Protein subunits make a chain folds. If they're arranged properly, they fold a chain, the chain folds into a shape that'll do a job. But the probability of getting all the amino acids to line up correctly is astronomically small. And in my book, Signature in the Cell, I make a calculation of that. And there are 3 different degrees of freedom and factors that have to be considered. One is you got to get the right amino acid in the right place, and that's roughly a 1 in 20 probability because there's 20 different amino acids. Then you've got to get the right kind of chemical bond between them, called a peptide bond, and you only got to get a 50-50 chance of getting that right. And then it turns out, and this is the person's question, that all of the amino acids come in a left-handed version and a right-handed version. And proteins can only be made out of left-handed amino acids. So that's a further complicating factor. When you run all those numbers, I got a calculation for the probability of getting a protein by chance. I can't remember the exact numbers. It was something like 1 chance in 10 to the 95th to get the sequencing right, and then you had another. Anyway, the bottom line is that the proteins are so improbable that if every event in the history of the universe, from the Big Bang till now, were devoted to trying to get amino acids to hook up in the right way, you would only be able to search 1/10 trillion trillionth of the possible number of arrangements in that period of time, meaning that it's overwhelmingly more likely that chance will fail than succeed. And for that reason, nobody thinks that chance is the explanation for the origin of life anymore in origin of life research. It's a dead letter. So, yeah. Anyway, the exact numbers are in my book, and you can have a look if you were the person that asked that very high-level question.
How can the scientific discussions regarding God's influence lead to discussions about philosophy and morality?
Well, I would say it would lead there in this particular way. If there is a compelling scientific argument for the existence of God, and I hope I've not made a proof, but I've argued for God as an inference to the best explanation for the physical evidence we have, not a proof in a mathematical sense of certainty, but rather in more of the legal sense of beyond reasonable doubt, good reason to believe it. So if we have good reason to believe that God exists, then that suggests a different conception of morality than the one that is common in our culture now, which is a more relativistic concept of morality, which is to say, you have your ideas about what's right, and I have my ideas that ethical truths and values are relative to persons or groups. Instead, the traditional Judeo-Christian view is that there is an objective basis of morality, and moral propositions are objectively true. It's objectively true that persons have eternal value. They have intrinsic dignity, having been made in the image of their creator. So if you can again begin to talk about a creator, you can again begin to assert that kind of a notion of human value and personhood. Human rights derive from that. That is, by the way, the basis of our whole system of government. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. We've lost that idea of inalienable rights and dignity because we've adopted a relativistic conception of morality. So if we get the God hypothesis back, we can begin to assert in a public way the moral basis of our whole culture.
So needed, so needed. Why do secular educators and scientists target only Christians, not Muslims, Hindus, or Buddhists? Don't those faiths also have creation stories and beliefs that should seem equally foolish to the secular mainstream scientists? Could it be that those others do not pose a risk to their narrative?
Maybe I'll just leave that question hanging out there for people to think about. I mean, it's an interesting one. There's an old quotation that's attributed to G.K. Chesterton. He says, behind every double standard lies a single hidden agenda. And there's sometimes in politics where there's people on completely opposite sides of an issue who team up because the real enemy is a common enemy, not because even though they disagree with each other. So I think there is, I don't know exactly how to answer that as far as what's going on in the schools with peoples of other faiths. There may be persecution of them as well, but there are some strange double standards in our culture that suggest that that the Christianity of all the faiths, or perhaps the Jewish perspective as well. Our Jews have long been persecuted, and is uniquely threatening to secularism. So.
Please speak about the merging of artificial intelligence and humans. Elon Musk is working on some sort of AI implants to improve and give eternal life to humans.
One of my former students has just published a book called The Myth of AI, critiquing what's called strong artificial intelligence. His name is Eric Larson. He's a philosopher and a computer scientist. And the book was published with Harvard University Press. It's quite readable. And for people who are wondering about the overreach of the artificial intelligence research program, it'd be a very good book to get a hold of. The basic idea is that there are certain modes of reasoning that we engage in that computers can replicate. Rule-based reasoning of induction and deduction. That's why computers can win chess games against even really smart chess players. But there's another type of reasoning, which is the reasoning we do in science and detective work and law and medicine, which I characterize in the book as inference to the best explanation. It uses a different type of inference called abduction, which is not, strictly speaking, rule-based, and requires drawing on our tacit knowledge of other things that we know from our background knowledge. And computers are hopeless at doing this. And that's why we have a lot of trouble with self-driving automobiles and things like that still, you know. And the idea beyond, so getting that type of, computers to do that type of reasoning is very problematic. And getting code to produce consciousness is a thing altogether beyond that, an even more difficult problem. So there's in this discussion, there's something called the frame problem, there's the abductive reasoning problem, and then there's the consciousness problem. And all of these are unsolved in AI research. There's something, the AI research is actually teaching us, I think, a lot more about what is uniquely special about being a human being.
Yeah, yeah.
What computers can't do, it maps to what we alone can do.
Yeah.
It's very special.
What are your thoughts regarding scientists or government wanting to alter people genetically to not have faith or belief in God?
No, very bad idea. Very bad idea. Yeah. And also not at all possible. Let's be real. Genes just make proteins, okay? Proteins do not explain our consciousness. They don't explain the contents of our minds. When people attempt to give reductive, genetic or evolutionary explanations for the origin of, for example, religious belief, they're extending the evolutionary paradigm way beyond where it has any reasonable prospects for providing explanatory power. We can't explain, right? Neo-Darwinism does not currently explain how we can get from one protein fold, a stable protein structure, to a novel protein fold. That is right now an insoluble problem in Neo-Darwinism. If we can't get from one protein to another, we cannot explain the contents of the human mind. And yet, this is all around us. The social sciences have imbibed this stuff and given us Darwinian explanations for every possible human behavior. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah. The new James Webb telescope is supposed to show us the origin of the universe, the actual Big Bang. What do you think it'll show us?
Oh, it's a very fascinating thing, and I talked to one of your parishioners who's done some work on the rockets that have put it out in space. Yeah. I hope to talk to him afterwards. It sounds pretty exciting. I did a short article on the James Webb for the Federalist right before Christmas. They ended up launching it a few days late on Christmas Day. What they're looking for and have the capacity to detect is the very first light coming from the first galaxies. And there is in the early cosmology, there is the affirmation of a beginning. There's a dark period of cosmology where visible light is being absorbed, and then as the galaxies start to form, the light begins to be emitted. And so the presupposition of this search is interestingly biblical, if I can use a bit of hyperbole, in that it presupposes the same thing that the Bible does, is that the universe had a beginning, and the first created thing that begins to spread throughout the universe is light. So they're looking for that light, and one of the things they'll be able to detect about it is the degree to which it's been stretched out as the universe has stretched out. And that stretching of light was one of the first clues we had that suggested that the universe is expanding outward in all directions. It's called the red shift. Light that's stretched, that has a longer wavelength, looks redder than it should otherwise look. If you shine light through a prism, it separates into red to violet. Red light has longer wavelengths, and so the light coming from the distant galaxies that Edwin Hubble and some of the astronomers first discovered was red shifted. It had a longer wavelengths than it should have for its spectral lines. And the James Webb telescope is looking for light from a very far distance out in space, corresponding to the very earliest moments after the beginning of the universe. And since that light is way out there, it should be uber red shifted, because we know that the further out a galaxy is, the more the light gets stretched. So these from these very early galaxies should be uber red shifted, and that would provide additional support for the evidence we have for an expanding universe outward from a beginning.
Can you give an explanation of the God particle in relation to CERN and how that affects a scientific creationist point of view?
Okay, the CERN is the place in Switzerland where the physicists have been smashing atoms and elementary particles into each other with their big superconducting super collider. And they have been looking for something called a supersymmetry that would provide and there's a certain kind of particle that would be the symmetric particle of another kind of elementary particle, and that's a prediction. The existence of that symmetric counterpart is a prediction of string theory. And so that would, if they find that, that'd be like the holy grail of physics, so they've termed that the God particle. Problem is they didn't find it, and so there are some scientists that are really starting to question string theory as the fundamental, it's a theory of the fundamental constitution of matter. It says that the fundamental elements of matter are little vibrating strings of energy. It's kind of a cool theory in some ways, but it's got some problems. And in any case, it has nothing to do with God. I mean, nothing directly. The God particle, if they found it, would not tell us anything about whether God exists or not. It would only tell us about whether string theory was the right theory of the fundamental constituents of matter.
Yeah. Wow. I want to thank you. I want to thank you for being here. I think the Discovery Institute and what you and others are doing is a wonderful affirmation for sort of an approach I've had to life and in raising our girls, and that is they will frequently, or we frequently, run into questions for which there's no apparent answer, some of which seem to maybe even contradict our faith. But if you find the right people to talk to, who have the right perspective and the right specialty, there's an answer for every one of these issues that actually supports our faith and encourages us in our walk with God. So thank you so much for the devotion of your life and what you've given yourself to.
Thank you, Pastor. Thank you.
Apparently we sold out back there, but the return of the God hypothesis is available, I'm sure, on Amazon, unless it's been banned, and you can pick up your own copy. Would encourage you to do that and look at the other publications and at Discovery Institute's website so that you can access a lot of the resources that they have there for you. We didn't get to all of your questions, but if your question wasn't answered, I'll be standing right down here afterwards. I'd be happy to give you an answer. Hey, we are so thrilled that you are here tonight. So grateful for your support of Apologia. And those of you who are watching online, if you believe in what Westgate is doing with Apologia, I want to encourage you, like Pastor Eric did, if you'd consider beyond supporting your church, if you'd consider donations to Westgate Chapel for Apologia, that will help us with 2022 and the guests that we have. But thank you for coming. And God bless you as you head home. Good night.